Welcome to the Digital Mindfulness Podcast. I'm Lawrence Ampofo, and this is session number 3. Welcome to the Digital Mindfulness Podcast. I'm Lawrence Ampofo. Today's guest on the show is none other than Dr. Alex Soojung Kim Pang. His last book, The Distraction Addiction, is an absolutely fascinating read. It focuses on the idea of contemplative computing, which is how to use information technologies and digital experiences in ways that don't distract us and fracture our attention, but instead help us to focus, concentrate, and to be creative. He's currently writing another book which is called Rest, How Working Less Gets More Done, which we're going to be talking about in this interview. And this really focuses on the reasons why people, incredibly productive people like Charles Darwin, Charles Dickens, and other people like them got so much done whilst only working about 4 hours a day, and how we can learn to work like them. Alex is also a technology forecaster and a futurist, and he's also a senior consultant with Strategic Business Insights. He's also been a lecturer in the history of science and technology, and a fun fact for everyone listening to the show is that he's even edited the Encyclopedia Britannica. So I am really excited to welcome Alex on the show. Alex, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Lawrence. It's a pleasure.
Alex, that claim to fame that you've edited the Encyclopedia Britannica, I'm really kind of fascinated about that. What sections did you work on?
Well, I was the managing editor of the Britannica, so I was responsible for the whole thing. I was the high priest at the Temple of Knowledge. We had a staff of about 20 editors who were specialists in various fields. And so I myself didn't spend a whole lot of time putting red pencil to paper, but really was in charge of working with them. For me, the fun part, I actually got to do some commissioning of articles, which was essentially an excuse to write to really, really interesting people and ask them to do stuff for me. And one of the nice things when you get a letter from the Encyclopedia Britannica asking you to write, generally you tend to say yes. So it was, So it was an easy way to meet interesting people.
Well, The Distraction Addiction, like it's not your first book, but your last book, to me it was absolutely fascinating. I read it a few times, and for many reasons it was absolutely fascinating. But when I talk to people about digital mindfulness in general, about basically how they go about using technology healthily, how they can combine wisdom and technology, they always have a really compelling, really unique story of either why they're interested in it or how they got into it. And so I'm really interested in kind of your superhero origin story. How did you come to this topic?
Well, I think if I have a superhero origin story, it's more like the $6 Million Man. In that, for one thing, there's a heavy technology element, but second, it starts with it starts with a crash and a near disaster. So, I wrote the book that would have helped me if I was dealing with all of these issues. I have for the last 15 years worked as a technology forecaster and futurist. And so what that means is that I'm spending an awful lot of time following trends, reading very, very broadly in the technical literature and cultural stuff, big magazines, little things, doing a lot of work, a lot of projects with different clients. So that means you are at their beck and call. You're working on things that are interesting to them, and you're juggling a lot of projects. And so what this means, what this meant for me after a few years was that this kind of constant whirlwind of motion of having to read things quickly, digest them, try and make connections to other stuff that I'd seen, fly off somewhere and facilitate a workshop, then fly somewhere else. This was all having a real effect on my capacity to focus and to concentrate. I was still able to get the work done, but I was feeling like I had the abilities that I had spent so long developing as a graduate student and as an academic, an ability to read things really carefully, to think really deeply, and which had the same abilities that had made me attractive at first as a forecaster and futurist were starting to slip away. And this was not something I was not ready to feel like I had like the best ideas of my life were in the rearview mirror. And so I took a step back and started trying to figure out, okay, how do you deal with this? I wasn't, none of us, I think, are in the position of being able to turn all this stuff off and just, not go online. I guess if I became an organic farmer or something, maybe that would be viable. But or if there are so many other radical changes you would need to make in order to avoid these technologies that that's a route that is practical for only a tiny fraction of us. And so it felt to me like, first of all, this was the challenge was to figure out how to live better with these technologies. As someone who had previously studied history of science and history of technology, I was very much immersed in a kind of scholarly tradition that argued that the technologies that we use, the big ideas that we hold, are ones that are not inevitable, but they are ones that are crafted by people at particular times, often for particular reasons, and that gave me a sense that the way in which we live with these technologies, the way in which we use smartphones or the web or social media, were that these interactions, these designs were not inevitable. They were not the kind of logical conclusion of technical analysis or the kind of grand unfolding of these systems, but rather they were things that were shaped by people and could be reshaped by users. This was also the time when there was a bunch of really interesting stuff coming out on the scientific benefits of mindfulness. And so it seemed to me that literature offered a way of thinking about the challenge of attention and the challenge of rebuilding one's attention. And so I started meditating, which helped quite a lot. And then I started also looking at how it is that people use social media, the way in which we interact with smartphones, what sort of effect that has on our attention, and how we can begin to examine those relationships to understand where they go wrong, to understand what's good about them, and to begin to either adjust them or adjust ourselves, adjust our relationships with them, so as to allow them to serve us the way that we want, to help to use them in ways that make us smarter, that make us more productive, that make us better versions of ourselves, rather than leaving us perpetually fractured and distracted. And then the last piece was I got this offer to go to Microsoft Research Cambridge for several months. And I think there's nothing that an American academic likes more than the opportunity to spend several months in Cambridge, England. And so, but it was there, in a research group of social scientists and of engineers who do nothing but think about the future of technology and the social life of devices, that I really hammered out of the ideas behind contemplative computing and became convinced that there really was, that this stuff really was, not just possible for me, but scalable for everyone, accessible to everyone, and that got me, to write the book.
Could you? That's brilliant. I would absolutely love to go to that research center, thinking about the future of technology all day. Sounds amazing. Mm-hmm. But I really want to delve more into this idea of contemplative computing. Actually, what is that? What does that mean?
So the big idea with contemplative computing is that we can learn to use information technologies in ways that help us be more mindful and more focused, rather than be more perpetually distracted and mentally fractured. And that involves doing a couple things. And I think the first is recognizing that our relationships with information technologies are really deep and profound, and they reflect what can be really terrific human abilities. I think that if you look at the long history of humankind's relationship with technology, you come to realize that humans actually have never. We think of ourselves as living in a kind of uniquely high-tech world, a world saturated with devices and things and material culture and so on. And that may be true, but it's not quite as new as we think. Humans have actually never lived in a world without technology. We have co-evolved with it. And the history of human evolution is really a history of our co-evolution with our tools, starting from stone axes a couple million years ago to cooked food, weapons, clothing, and on down to technologies that are designed to augment or enhance our perceptive capacities, our cognitive abilities. And these are not just things that have affected our physical shape. Our hands are different from those of our primate cousins, mainly because we have to grip things differently than they do. Our arms are also different because we're able to throw stuff far more effectively. But also but additionally, we have a capacity, a kind of cognitive capacity, to use these tools in ways that extend our own mental abilities, and to derive an incredible pleasure from using technologies well, from mastering them, that arguably is unique to humans. And it's very, it is very difficult to know the mental state of a capuchin monkey when it's using a tool, or a gorilla. But it is absolutely the case that some of the most pleasurable, transcendent moments that humans experience are ones that involve using technologies really well. Musical instruments are a brilliant example of that. Or, children when they first learn to ride a bicycle, and that they have that feeling of being able to go faster than they ever have before. That that is a kind of pleasure that sort of psychologists like Mihai Csikszentmihalyi call flow. And it's one that you see with, sort of kids on bicycles. It's what you see with, programmers when they are deep in writing code. It's what musicians have during a really good concert. And pilots when they're flying a plane. And this is a kind of reward that we've developed for using technologies really well. It's also one that I think that and that's a sort of state that is accessible to us with with the sort of technologies we carry around with us all the time. But the tragedy is that it is all too rarely the case that we're able to experience that for various design reasons, and I think for reasons that have to do with the kind of strategic choices that designers or companies make that essentially come down to sort of supporting designs that encourage kind of addiction and kind of social behavior over flow. But recognizing that that technologies are sometimes designed in ways that work against flow, that work against that kind of mastery, is the second important thing in contemplative computing, because that then opens the door to figuring out how you can use them in ways that help you be more mindful. In a sense, being more mindful about the technology helps you be more mindful while using it. And through things like experimenting with your devices, experimenting with things as simple as the settings on your smartphone, how you carry it, to how you schedule or manage your interactions with with email when you're at work, up to setting aside time to have or to be away from your devices, to take what they call digital Sabbaths. Mm-hmm. These all represent in various ways practices that you can develop that improve your relationship with your devices, that help keep you connected as you really need to be, but which begin to give you control over your interactions, over your technologies, to put you back in control. And by doing that, that is what allows you to become more mindful while using technologies without giving up of what is, what's good and beneficial about them. I think it's also, that also helps you sort of distinguish between things that, things in these relationships that you should worry about and things that you shouldn't. So, for example, I have not memorized a phone number except for my wife and my kids in the last 10 years. I think like a lot of us, my dad's cell phone number, my in-laws, I don't know, because my phone remembers them, right? And my phone does a far better job of recalling those than I ever could. My own feeling is, in the zombie apocalypse, who do I need to reach immediately, right? Now, this assumes that during the zombie apocalypse, the phones are still going to work. But, I think that outsourcing telephone numbers to my telephone works really well for me. And it's really good. It does a very, very good job of that. And I think that there's nothing at all kind of problematic about employing that strategy. I think an example of one that can be mindful or mindless is taking lots of pictures. I think that there are, it certainly is the case that there are people for whom picture taking turns into a kind of substitute for actually looking at stuff. But there are also people, as the kind of great flourishing of high-end photography often with fairly lo-fi technologies, with things like Instagram or of Reveal. There are people who use who use digital cameras to observe the world more closely. And I think that we can recognize that we have the option to develop what photographers call the camera eye. That sort of the ability when we use these technologies to sort of to take more notice of the way that light works, or color, or to pay closer attention to the world, rather than using the technology to more mindlessly record it. Mm-hmm. So, but I think those there are many more choices like that in our lives than we realize. And sort of practicing contemplative computing is about recognizing those moments and sort of not dealing with them mindlessly, not treating them as defaults, not necessarily accepting the defaults that are presented to us by device makers or media companies, but sort of thinking about what's going to work for us, and sort of making and sort of being able to make good choices, and through that being better users or being better people.
So then contemplative computing, it's about it's a practice, right?
Yes. Right.
But what I'm really interested in, there goes someone calling me. What I'm really interested in is actually whether actually this mindfulness can be built into the machine, whether you can actually, because everything you were talking about flow, about attention, focus, mindfulness, these are all kind of states of mind, aren't they? Right. Like kind of they're very human qualities. And can you actually build this into software, into machines, do you think?
You certainly can do things that encourage it. The tricky thing about mental states is that I think it's a lot easier to trigger mindless behavior than mindful behavior, partly because it takes a lot less effort to be mindless, than it takes to pay attention. But it is, but for people who want to pay attention, there certainly are things that you can do. So I think that the Zenware movement is a really nice example of software that is designed to minimize the amount of distraction that you have when working on challenging tasks, and nudge you to concentrating more. So this is, I think, a couple examples are writing programs like Lightroom and OmWriter, both of which are very minimalist word processors, but they are minimalist in very, very different ways. Kind of minimalist in the way, I think that John Cage and Philip Glass are arguably kind of minimalist composers, but their work sounds pretty different. But Lightroom looks like a terminal emulator from about 1990, right? Black screen, green cursor. You can change that stuff, but that's the default. And the idea is that it is a kind of visual reminder of a simpler time when you were when you did one thing with a computer and then you closed that program and you went and you did another thing. OmWriter is something more like the sort of digital equivalent of a Zen rock garden. It's a fascinating mix of sounds and ambient music and sort of clean screen that for me provides a whole bunch of little nudges that remind me explicitly or more subtly that I've opened this thing up in order to focus and get work done. And I think that it is so. it is always a challenge to create things that put people into flow. And I think I think that for designers, creating devices that that people can use to get into those states and that nudge them toward it is actually should be regarded as a huge win. I think that if you look at musical instruments, something like a piano can take years to master. There's no really easy way to learn how to play piano, to play it well enough so that you reach that wonderful state where you feel like you no longer know when you're playing where your hands end and the keyboard begins, where you are in complete control over what you're expressing, and that's not something you can get to easily. And even after centuries, piano designers haven't cracked the code of how do you allow people to get to that stage in 1 month rather than in years.
The hacking culture, right?
Right. How do no one has yet figured out how to hack musical instruments that way. But however, and I think what that suggests to me is that is actually an incredibly difficult problem. But the good news is that supporting people who want to get into those states is itself an obviously good thing that eliminating distractions and encouraging flow and then leaving it up to people to find it for themselves is, I think that's a big win.
Because one of the things you talked about in the book a lot, which really struck with me, was that when we're never really out of the office, like the same email programs that we'll use in the office or at work are the same that we'll use at home. It's the same thing we look at, when we wake up or whatever. So all of the kind of, I guess, all of the software and the hardware that we tend to use is kind of really focused on productivity and kind of they're not built with this idea of kind of fostering a kind of optimal mindful state of mind, but also kind of focusing on people's I guess that their physical health as well. But to what extent do you think though that is this, like I say, a human practice rather than, say, an engineering kink that has to be figured out?
Right. I think that it is, I would say it is 80% human practice, 20% engineering. In the sense that there certainly are things that designers can do to sort of support that intentionality on the part of users, to encourage them. But I think that that there is still there's still always work that people have to put into it. It's like it's sort of like if you're designing a bicycle, you want to make it light. You want to make it efficient. You want to make it a pleasure to ride, well balanced. But people still have to do the work of actually pedaling, and I think that's sort of finding it, getting into those positive mental states is kind of like riding a bicycle. You got to learn you have to learn your own balance. You have to do the work yourself, and if you expect to be carried, then you're now talking about a very, very different kind of experience and a very different kind of design challenge.
That's great. So kind of moving on a little bit from this, can you talk to us a little bit about your new book? How is it possible to do more by working less hours?
Right. Well, I started getting interested in this when I was looking at the life of Charles Darwin. And one of the things we have really, really good documentation of Darwin's life, 14,000 letters at Cambridge University in the archives, hundreds more in various other places. And we have a really good understanding of his daily schedule. Now, and what you realize when you look at his daily life is that, okay, Charles Darwin came up with the theory of evolution by natural selection. He wrote 19 books. He was one of the most incredibly productive sort of people you could imagine, right? I know lots of people who would do anything to be, to have a fraction of his of his success.
Even by today's standards.
Even by today's standards, he was amazing.
Yeah.
And yet, when you look at his daily schedule, Darwin, worked at his desk or in the laboratory only about 4 or 5 hours a day. The rest of the time, he's puttering around in the garden. He is out walking on a path that he built on his property called the Sand Walk. He spends hours out there every day. And he is clearly, at the same time, always absorbed in science. He never stops thinking about this stuff. But if he had been working in working in an office or working for a university, he would have been fired after a couple years because it would have looked like he just wasn't, he wasn't showing up. And so I started thinking, we have today this belief that, there's a clear relationship between how much work you do and how productive you are. How many hours you are in the, that if you spend 70 hours in the office, you're going to be twice as productive than if you spend 35. And that in order to do great work, you have to make that kind of investment, that kind of sacrifice. But what I began to see with Darwin and then looking at the lives of other creative and productive people was that they didn't do that. That they worked really hard for much shorter periods than we do, but they still managed to get an awful lot done. And when I broadened out and looked not just at how many hours they spent, but what they did the rest of the day, I noticed a couple things. One of them was that that they spent an awful lot of time doing a few common things. I mentioned Darwin spent a lot of time on the Sand Walk, and a huge number of people spend an awful lot of time out on walks. Charles Dickens, Darwin's contemporary, could walk. He would write about 4 hours in the morning and then go for a 10-mile walk in the afternoon. And there's who was it? Friedrich Nietzsche. Soren Kierkegaard, they were all famous walkers. Nietzsche said that all great philosophical ideas come in walking. And what walking and a few other practices indicate is that really creative people discover a relationship between their working lives and their resting lives. That in which the two things are not opposites, the two things are not competitors, as they often feel in our modern lives, but rather they're partners. They're kind of two sides of the same coin. And I think that, and so what I'm arguing in the new book is that there are certain kinds of rest that we can treat like in the same way that Buddhist monks treat breathing, or for that matter, singers and athletes treat breathing. Right? Breathing is something we have done literally since the moment we were born. But we can all, so it is something that comes naturally. But we can also treat it as a practice. We can treat it as it is a skill. It is something that we can learn to do better, and in so doing, have better lives. I think rest is the same. There's actually, when you learn to practice kind of skilled rest or kind of deliberate rest, what that gives you is space for your mind to keep working on problems even when you are apparently occupied in something else, and that sort of opens up the opportunity to have the kinds of insights or aha moments or kind of creative epiphanies that make the lives of people like Einstein or Darwin or Ingmar Bergman seem so remarkable to us. But these are things that we're beginning to we're beginning to understand in scientific terms, rather than treat as kind of semi-mystical or as sort of fundamentally indescribable, and that sort of and that we can we are beginning to understand why it is that certain kinds of rest facilitate or support or creative thinking and lead to these sorts of insights, and how we can thus how we can learn to practice them better, how we can turn rest into a skill, and how we can use it to in essence, consciously work less while still getting more done.
I really love this idea of rest being something that we learn, rest being a skill that we can, something we can do better. Because, from in the UK, even when you get a job, you're contracted according to a number of hours, right? The number of hours you work is, in our minds is directly linked to our productivity. And I imagine in the States, it's exactly the same or even worse. And we were talking about this, just in a pre-interview before, but you were talking about the importance of mind wandering now. And I'm really interested in this because you were saying that, mind wandering, this was something that, I was actively discouraged from doing as a child, and even again as an adult when like I say, I work using my brain, and I was actively discouraged from looking out of the window and just mind wandering. And people often say, you're not doing anything, you need to get back to your work, and you say that actually mind wandering is a fundamental part of being productive and being creative. Could you just expand on that a little, please?
Sure. Okay. So mind wandering. So, first off, mind wandering is sort of the state you're in. Let's say when you are you're sitting at the desk, you're staring at the window, your attention is unfocused, and you let your brain essentially sort of follow whatever path it wants. It's the state that you can get into also in a positive way when you are, let's say, walking in the park. In a negative way, sometimes when you're driving and you realize all of a sudden you've gone you've gone a couple kilometers and you barely remember what you were doing, sort of the road. You're just kind of operating on automatic. That's the negative version of it. But mind wandering is, we are beginning to recognize it is different from distraction in the sense that when you are distracted, you should be focused on subject A, but instead you are concentrating on subject B. In mind wandering, you allow your mind to be free because you don't have that instantaneous obligation. You don't need to keep track of what the child is doing on the swing or the car in front of you. And what we are discovering is that in those moments, the brain tends to do a few really interesting things. We tend to think about, or our minds naturally gravitate toward thinking about the future, thinking about, reviewing challenges that we've faced recently, which can be, anything from difficult conversations to technical problems to, homework that we're trying to finish. And in that state, that kind of unfocused state, our minds will continue working on things even when we are not consciously focused on them. And that is the precursor to those moments where, all of a sudden you realize, wait, I should be doing X. Or, if I try this, then the experiment will work. Or the answer to the problem is, is this thing. Mm-hmm. And so, for people who are in businesses that involve high degrees of creativity rather than simply work that involves just following rules very, very exactly. And to be honest, the number of people who I think it's very obvious that people who are designers or working in advertising agencies are do creative work, but virtually everybody's job requires a measure of creativity. So, but mind wandering, it turns out, is an essential component to effective problem solving. And it's often the case that after you've been working on a problem for a while, if it's a challenging one, that your unconscious brain is able to solve it better and faster and more elegantly than your conscious mind. And so this, it turns out, is what explains why it is, it helps explain a whole bunch of these stories of sudden insight or aha moments that are woven into the history of science and the history of music and the history of literature. People don't have those flashes of insight, it turns out, unless they've been working really hard on a problem, and then they kind of take their hands off the wheel. You don't think of the opening bars of the Fifth Symphony unless you've been working on the Fifth Symphony for quite a while. Likewise, I will never have an insight into, the history of Arabic poetry or quantum physics because I don't know anything about those fields. You don't have aha insights about things that you don't know anything about. You have them for things that you've been working on. But if your days, if your working life is arranged in ways that crowd out opportunities for mind wandering, or if you are so constantly engaged with devices, so that if your default is to fill every waking moment, those moments when you are waiting for a friend at the cafe, or the time in the bank in line, or when you are walking to work, if you spend those moments staring at screens, that's not mind wandering. That is having your brain engaged by Facebook or texts or email. And if you either do not have time to mind wander, or you don't allow yourself time to mind wander, then you close off the opportunities for that kind of creative thinking, for that last critical step in the creative process. And it's still entirely still likely that you will finally solve those problems, but it's going to require a lot more conscious effort, and it's probably going to require more time than if you recognized the value of that deliberate rest and trust that if you do this, that your unconscious is going to actually solve, it is going to come up with the answer to the problem. As one mathematician put it, he would have these insights regularly. And he realized at some point, he said, that his subconscious mind was a better mathematician than he was. And that in a way, what he needed to learn to do was to work just enough so that he could pass the problem on to his subconscious. And his subconscious would do the rest. And this is in some measure, first of all, something that we can all learn how to do. It is something that we tend not to do out of a belief that you solve problems by attacking them directly for long periods. And it's also a casualty of our belief that rest is fundamentally unimportant, that rest and work are competitors in our lives, and that we have enough stuff that we really have to get done so that we don't really have time to rest any longer. And as a consequence, we actually ironically reduce the odds that we're going to solve the critical problems that we want to solve.
Gosh, see, I wish I'd known this in my 20s, right?
I wish I had known this in my 20s as well. I have spent I am 50 now, and the number of years that I spent believing that you solved problems, in the 23rd hour, with massive amounts of caffeine running through your system, were, legion.
It's true, and with absurd amount of cramming, or I think even for me, just professionally and in university, me thinking that if I kind of read for 10 hours a day, then that's good, and it's a badge of honor. I think there's lots of kind of cultural conditioning that's behind this as well. But I love the idea though that you say that you work really, really, really hard on a problem, and then you come away from it, and then almost let the subconscious deal with it. Yeah.
No, and I think that we think that this is the way to the way to work for a couple for a couple of reasons. And I think one of them is that we have taken into the service sector and professional services assumptions about how we should spend our days that come from factory work, right? Where you are working continuously for X hours per day, and that is a productive day. Well, if you are tending a machine, then that works. That maybe works pretty well, but the assumption that an 8-hour day is a natural day is, it's only natural because unions negotiated it with capitalists a century ago, right? It's not, there's nothing organic about it. But we also live, as you said, in a culture in which being stressed, being overworked becomes a kind of badge of honor. I think it is really remarkable that for people who are very well off, their grandparents would have regarded, would have seen this as crazy, that successful, wealthy people had leisure time. That was the whole point of being wealthy and successful, was so that you had time to devote to, building art museums or going sailing or, spending a month in the country hunting and shooting at stuff. Yeah. And for their descendants, though, the proof both that they are successful and that they deserve their success is to, have 80-hour work weeks. For the rest of us, for those of us who are not quite so so fortunate, overwork becomes a sign either that we're too important to be made redundant, or that we really care about our work, that we're passionate about it in ways that deserve to be rewarded, or there is a certain perverse psychological pleasure that comes from feeling like you have so much going on that you can't stop to breathe. If you feel like you're constantly in motion, then you must be getting important stuff done. And that affect, that feeling of busyness, is something that is really easy to confuse with real productivity. There was a wonderful study done a few years ago by the late Clifford Nass, who was a professor at Stanford, in which he looked at at multitasking and the relationship between the amount of stuff that heavy multitaskers got done and how they felt about their work. And what he found was an almost perfect inverse relationship between how much people were able to accomplish when they were multitasking and how good they felt about their work. So, sort of, the more they were multitasking, the less they actually got done, but the more they felt like they were achieving. And so I think this, or particularly when you're doing, first off, when you're doing creative work. Second, when you also at the same time work in environments that require dealing constantly with clients or communicating with bosses or following up on 1,001 little tasks, it is really easy to get into a state where you feel like you are getting a lot done. You feel like, or if you are in a sort of state of productivity and accomplishment, when in fact the exact opposite is true. At least if you are a sculptor or you're a farmer, at the end of the day, you can look at the number of pots you've made or the size of the field you have tilled. With knowledge work, it's much harder to measure at the end of the day what you've gotten done and how important it is. And so in the absence of those kinds of visible external measures, we tend to substitute feeling. And so that's, and it's a lot harder for us to justify spending 5 hours really heads down, really focused on a problem, and then spending, a little bit of time doing email, checking in on stuff, and then the rest of it, or of usefully staring out the window. That's a lot harder for us to justify than feeling like we've been, going at it hammer and tongs for 10 hours. But in that first state, we're more likely to get done the things we really need to do than when we're in the second.
And I know that people listening to this are going to say, usefully looking out the window. That's the phrase they're going to show to their boss. Boss, I'm just usefully looking out of the window. But I think, I think the phrase, it really is apt. I don't think it's any accident at all that people say, for example, they get their best ideas in the shower or when they run. I can't, for me, like it's that same stepping away from a problem, stepping away from things like notifications and distractions and letting your subconscious mind, right, do the heavy lifting. And, for me, I know when I run, I get some of my best ideas, or the really difficult problem I was working on suddenly becomes incredibly easy. And it's like, okay. So no, this is fascinating.
And the challenge that we one of the other challenges that we have is that the same technologies, the same devices that can get in the way of our ability to focus, that can erode our capacity to concentrate, also are the ones that fill that time where we used to spend mind wandering. And so it's a kind of 1-2 punch on our productivity and our creativity. It becomes harder for us to focus on things when it's appropriate to focus. It also becomes harder to let go and to just let your brain do its own thing when you have time for that.
So when you say that, if you're to take people's phones away or to kind of do that, are there kind of physical withdrawal symptoms from people? For example, people not having digital, like you were talking about, for example, people being digitally distracted, and
right.
and that's one thing that's absolutely essential. But what I'm interested in is actually what are some of these kind of physical traits of being digitally distracted?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there were a couple things that are really good symbols or signals of the degree to which we become accustomed to the presence of devices in our lives, and we become attuned to them in ways that we don't even recognize. So one of them is what Microsoft researcher Linda Stone called email apnea, or now device apnea, which is the tendency that people have when they're checking their email to hold their breath. You're waiting, the little ball is spinning and you're waiting for it to load, and a surprising majority of people hold their breath while that's happening. Now, this is not something that any email program designer intended, but it is something that we do automatically, that we do mindlessly, in anticipation of new mail. And that sounds like something relatively small, but our bodies treat that as a sign of stress. It activates the fight or flight reflex, and it makes us a little edgier and a little more likely maybe to respond to a passive-aggressive message or some new piece of news that we didn't want, in a way that maybe is less generous than we would if we had been calmer when our inbox started filling up. Another example is, I think, of what they call phantom cell phone syndrome, which is if you've ever had the feeling that your phone was buzzing in a pocket, but it actually wasn't in that pocket.
Oh yeah.
That happens because just as new parents discover that they can hear their baby crying, even in a room full of crying babies, you become really well attuned to your own child, and attuned to you are constantly listening for your baby. So too do we become accustomed to, without our sort of realizing it, the feel of the phone buzzing, because it's important that we know that we've got a new call coming in. And this is more so the case for people like medical residents or young lawyers, because if a call comes in and they miss it, that's a really bad thing. Professionally, it means that there's someone in the ER who's not getting attention, or a client who has some issue that is not being addressed instantaneously. And so we come to our bodies become so accustomed to the phone ringing and the necessity of paying attention for that ring or for that buzz, that it becomes easy for us to mistake the feel of the wind or something else brushing in our pockets as the phone. Now, are there other things that are signs of physical signs of addiction to digital devices? Certainly, if you dig down deep enough into people's brains, metaphorically, one hopes, and not physically, you are going to find that, right? We do know that there are similarities in what goes on in the brain when we open up Facebook or Twitter, as what happens when we smoke a cigarette or eat cheesecake. Now, I think that's something useful to know. I would be personally, I think that while this is really interesting stuff, we need to recognize that this does not mean that we are ruled by our own dopamine receptors, and there is nothing that we can do to get over these addictions. It can be a challenge, and as neuroscientists like to say, dopamine and oxytocin are literally the only things you enjoy in life. Everything kind of translates into that, but at some level, it's like saying everything translates into electrical signals in the brain. That's true, but it doesn't necessarily help us or of understand or the possibility or of how to live better with our devices or of overcome distractions or addictions, nor is it something that and it also does not mean that there is nothing that we can do to to change the balance. So and then there are finally there are some curious physiological things that that happen. I think that furniture designer Herman Miller, for example, the design company, has documented the various ways in which people tend to the stress positions that people unconsciously take when they're using tablet devices or smartphones, and they're actually designing furniture that tries to accommodate them now. So rather than having people sit in a desk chair and kind of contort themselves into unpleasant positions, designing furniture that lets people sit a little more naturally or a little more easily while using a tablet. This sounds kind of whimsical, but apparently the additional stress on for example, or of your neck and spine when you spend a long time hunched over or a tablet device is over time that's actually pretty substantial. And so these are effects that we are not just experiencing internally, but we're beginning to see or have inscribed on our bodies as well.
Wow. So, I mean, having spoken about that, where do you think then, I guess, the design of technology is going? I mean, you spoke of furniture, etc., but how do you see software being designed in the future in a way that's contemplative and helps us become our better selves?
Right. Well, I think that we're in a point where we have a whole bunch of choices that we can make. I think we are at a point in the history of interaction design and the history of service design where we have learned a lot about how we can how to manipulate people's interests, how to manipulate their attention so as to get them to do things like gamble longer or gamble more money, to have more fun doing so. And we have designers of slot machines and video games and online games have done a brilliant job of exploring and exploiting those abilities. I think the challenge is to figure out how we can put those to good use, because actually a good bit of that work is inspired by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's work on flow. He had 20 years ago a description, an explanation of what flow states are, and this is a description that countless interaction designers and game designers have used ever since as a model for what they are trying to produce in users. The problem is that Csikszentmihalyi was actually interested not in the question of how do you make social media apps stickier, or how do you make e-commerce more frictionless and pleasant for users. He was interested in the question of how do we live better? What is it that makes the difference between a life that is fulfilling and a life that is not? And his argument was that that flow was the answer. The ability to do incredibly challenging things, but to do them so well that undertaking that challenge becomes a source of fulfillment. And so I think we have an opportunity. There's an opportunity to do something akin to the Reformation in the 16th century. To go back to the original text, to the original challenge of flow, and to use these tools that we've developed, to use the experience that we have had in building games and media apps, and figuring out how we can begin to use that to to support people's own desires to master devices, to find flow, and to do that in the service of things that they want to get done in their lives, or to solve big challenges in their own lives. I think also that we are another thing that I am certainly interested in and following is the rise of wearable devices and anticipatory computing. Anticipatory computing is the effort to understand your own life and your own schedule well enough so that rather than being asked, let's say, what is the traffic like between here and my next appointment, having a system that knows that is information you're going to need and provides it to you or before you have an opportunity to ask. I think that there are ways that you can develop those kinds of systems that make our lives a lot easier, that allow us to concentrate on things that really matter, or to make those unimaginably distracting. But I think that we are getting some experience with things like Zenware and other minimalist apps that can provide some guidance into how we can make these technologies help us be smarter, even as they themselves also become smarter. I think that I actually did some interviews with butlers a few months ago. Okay. I was there was in the news a thing about robot butlers, and there was a hotel in Cupertino, California, near the Apple World headquarters that was rolling out, as it were, a series of robot butlers. And I was curious, how does the work of a robot butler compare to a real butler? And the biggest, and the answer comes down to real human butlers don't just walk around in tuxedos and, carrying silver trays, bearing, martinis. But rather, they are people who look out for their employer's interests and who, on a day-to-day basis or even a minute-by-minute basis, make all kinds of choices about whether this call needs to be put through, whether this person should be, should be announced, whether the employer is concentrating on something and should absolutely not be disturbed, or whether even maybe they don't realize it, but they could really do with a break. And you compare that with, let's say, the way that our smartphones operate in their kind of natural default state, which is to assume that every text, every notification, every announcement that something a picture we posted got a new like, all of that needs to be shared with us. We need to know about it right now. And what we need are devices that are as thoughtful of our attention, thoughtful of our concentration, as human butlers are with their employers. What we have right now are devices that act more like children. They're constantly prodding us. They're constantly asking us to look at them, to pay attention to them, to acknowledge their existence. And I think we have an opportunity to create devices that are not just smarter, that can pass a Turing test, but are smarter about us and are smarter about what we need. And I think the challenge is to put that insight, put that technology to good use, to follow the insights that we've gained from decades of work in game design, decades of work on the science of happiness, and from the work of people who've designed Zenware and sort of other minimalist or sort of attention managing systems, and to sort of bring that to bear in the design of things like our smartphones and our wearable devices. We are going to spend, and I think what designers need to realize is that they are now not designing things that are competing for attention. They already have our attention. We spend more time with our smartphones, interacting with our smartphones on average than we do with our spouses. So, we are not going to get rid of these things. And the challenge no longer is to get more of that time. The challenge is to help us figure out how to use that time better, how to allow us, how to alert us to the things that really matter in a timely manner, but also to give us space to do the other important work in our lives, or space simply to do the important, the important work of resting.
Excuse me, they're coughing there. No, that's great. And wow, that was amazing. I could talk to you for this could go on all day. This is absolutely fascinating. And I can hear your dogs in the background, dying to be walked. So, I've only got a couple more questions
Sure.
for you, and
I'll try to be brief.
No problem at all. And the penultimate one is, what's your favorite book?
My favorite book. I think that I would have to go with Csikszentmihalyi's book Flow. That is because it's more than any recent book, the one that changed my life. Discovering it, I first read it really closely when I was at Microsoft Research Cambridge. So I have happy memories of it because of that association, but also as both an incredible model of scholarship, of scientific research, and as sort of a vision of how to think about the good life. It is, for me, unparalleled. So that's that and anything by Terry Pratchett.
Okay, nope. That is Csikszentmihalyi's Flow is fantastic. I absolutely adore it. So brilliant. So where can people find out more about you, and when can they get your new book? And
I am easily findable on Google. There is only one Alex Soojung Kim Pang in the world. It's one of the good things about having a really unusual, multi-ethnic name is that there's a lot less confusion in Google searches. But on Twitter, so my handle on just about everything, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or Google, is AskPang, AskPang. There is also, I have a blog about contemplative computing, which is surprisingly www.contemplativecomputing.org. And then the work on rest is you can follow on the Deliberate Rest blog, which is deliberate.rest. Rest turns out it's now itself a top-level domain. So I managed to get deliberate.rest for that. So those, and then those places will take you to everything else you can find about me.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for this. This was, like I said, this was brilliant. I could go on about this all day, but everything that you've referenced and spoke about today, I shall put it in the show notes. And Alex, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate having you on today.
You bet, Lawrence. It was a pleasure. Thanks very much.
So that was Alex Soojung Kim Pang. I hope you enjoyed that interview just as much as I did. If you'd like the show notes for this episode, you can go to digitalmindfulness.net/blog, and you can get all of the information and links to the different things that we were describing in the show. I hope you all got something from listening to this, really. Hearing Alex talk about the different ways that we're addicted to distraction, talking about email apnea and working less to get more done, were completely fascinating to me. I'll post the links to his books in the show notes. Finally, I just want to take a moment to thank you, the listener, for spending time with me today. I really appreciate it. We spend a lot of time putting these shows together so that you can create better digital experiences. We're here to help you. So head over to digitalmindfulness.net where you can find more interviews, resources, and all of that fun stuff. Until then, stay safe. If you have a second, please go to iTunes and leave a review for the show if you haven't done already. I really, really appreciate it. Until next week.